Hi, this is Alex, and if you love music, well, you've come to the right place because we're all about albums. I'm sure I'm going to get a lot of friction from this, but I'm going to say it. The decade of the 80s was my least favorite decade of music. In fact, I think it is actually the weakest decade to produce music. The only other time period I would include here is the years 1975 and 76. I thought music on the FM radio was extremely boring. There was nothing happening, but fear not, I heard the crashing waves coming, and yes, the new wave was coming. The first segment of the British bands coming over to shake up the music world, and they brought over some fun and really great pop sound, and those included Elvis Costello, Joe Jackson, Nick Lowe, amongst many others. But now let's get back to the topic at hand, which is the 1980s. So why do I consider the 1980s the weakest decade? Well, for several reasons. First off, there was no great music that really revolutionized the music we listen to. Also, it was a very repetitive sound using a lot of synthesized pop music. And finally, music was all about image back in the 1980s. In the 1980s, MTV was king, and MTV showed many music videos, and a music video would make or break an artist. In fact, musicians spent more money and more time making music videos than actually spending in the studio making good music. Fashion had a big impact in the music industry in the 1980s. An image of the band again was most important. Finally, this decade was the decade of commercialism and materialism. And if you don't believe me, well, I'm sure you can believe the biggest pop star from the 1980s, and that's Madonna. And as she said, she was a material girl in a material world. Well, you might say, this is just your opinion. The 1980s were great. I thought the music was fantastic. Well, fear not. I actually have some scientific proof to back me up. An article appeared on May 11th, 2015 in the music section of Uproxx, and it was written by Chris Morgan. The article was entitled, "There's Now Scientific Proof That the 80s Was Popular Music's Worst Decade." I kid you not. Well, in a nutshell, what the article states is that there was an engineer from a university in London, and he took approximately 17,000 songs off of the Billboard 100 list, and he took the years 1960 through 2010. He measured timbre, harmony, and chord changes. And what he found was, interestingly, that music was very diversified and did change quite a bit from era to era in music. Now, this was true throughout his time period study, with the exception of, yes, you guessed it, the 1980s. The 1980s was found to be a very homogeneous decade, a decade that had the same sound. So for you eclectic music lovers, those who like a diverse, popular sound, well, you're out of luck because the 1980s is not for you. And that included yours truly. Well, there you go, an article with scientific proof that the 1980s was the worst decade for music. However, there is a handful of albums that came out during the 1980s that I think were great albums, some of which became classic albums. And these are the albums that saved the 1980s for me. So which album saved the 1980s for me? Well, here's my list. And now my list is in no specific order. And some of the albums I'll just mention and others I'll talk about a little bit. So let's get started. First up is New Order's albums Power, Corruption, and Lies. It came out in 1983. And yes, I actually picked an album that was heavy in synthesizer. However, this is very intelligent and well-made synthesizer pop music. So it is possible to do. Although I don't love synthesized pop, this album actually I do like quite a bit. Next up is the album by Crowded House entitled Crowded House. It was their first album, which came out in 1986. This was a very smart and fresh pop sound. This album contained multiple hits, and I thought these hits were actually hits that deserved to be hits. Neil Finn and Paul Hester from the band Split Enz joined Nick Seymour, and the three of them lived in a house together, and thus the name of the band, Crowded House. This band would record many quality records throughout their careers, including one of my favorite albums, Wooden Face. Next up is the 1987 album by the 10,000 Maniacs entitled In My Tribe. The 10,000 Maniacs were an alternate rock indie band, and they featured the vocalist Natalie Merchant. Natalie Merchant, as you know, would go on to have a rather successful solo career. And she was very good friends with the REM band. This is the third album by the band, but it was its first successful album. This is a very poetic album, and an album I think most people will relate to and enjoy. For those of you who may remember, the Maniacs with Natalie Merchant did put on one of the most classic performances during the MTV short-lived series of Unplugged. Next, we have one of my favorite bands, Dire Straits, which in 1981 released Making Movies. This was a very strong album. This was the band's third album, and it was the first album to feature keyboards. This album had an expanded sound by the help of keyboardist Roy Bittan, and the band utilized keyboards throughout much of the remainder of their career. Roy Bittan, by the way, is from the E Street Band. Next up is one of my all-time favorite bands, a band that is extremely underrated, and a band that I think a lot of bands that came out in the 90s and the 2000s owe a lot to. They were one of the bands that carried the torch for intelligent, smart pop music, and that is the band XTC. And in 1986, they released their 8th studio album entitled Skylarking, and this is a most beautiful album. It's a very pastoral, nature-sounding album, and this album was produced by the great Todd Rundgren, who, as you know, recently finally made it into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and deservedly so. Next up, we have the band from Athens, Georgia, which in 1987 released the album Document, one of their better albums. Next up, we have the Pretenders, which, although their first album was released in late 1970s, their next album, called Pretenders 2, came out in early 1980s. Now, this band was a very strong, hard-edged rock band led by singer Chrissie Hynde, who, in my mind, is one of the best rock and roll singers of all time, whether it be male or female. And in 1986, we have one of the great albums entitled So by Peter Gabriel, who, as you know, is one of the original members of Genesis. He was obviously a bandmate of Phil Collins, who went on to have many successful albums also in the 1980s. This was a multi-platinum album that got a lot of FM airplay, and I thought this was an extremely strong album with great pop and rock tunes, and I strongly recommend, if you don't know this album, to go out and purchase this album, and I think you'll really enjoy this album. Although the 1980s did not produce many singer-songwriters, one that was in the 1980s was quite a good one, and that is Tracy Chapman's first album, entitled, obviously, Tracy Chapman. Tracy was a protest singer, and her albums featured the lyrics, which really many of the bands in the 1980s really didn't care much about. So the first Tracy Chapman album, I think, is great if you want an album that has some meaning to it. Next up is a band that I've already mentioned with another great album in the 1980s. It's their first album entitled Murmur. Again, this is the great REM. REM is an alternate rock band which incorporated both folk music and country music and mixed it into their now classic pop sound. And now one of my favorite albums of the 1980s, and that is 'Til Tuesday's second album entitled Welcome Home. Now this is the follow-up album to the very successful first album with their pop hit Voices Carry. Now this album showed their growth in both musicianship and in lyrics, and that is probably mostly due to Aimee Mann. Yes, Aimee Mann was in the band 'Til Tuesday, and this album is sort of a prequel to what you are going to see in the coming years in her musical career, which thank God is still going and going strong. Next up is an album that many of you probably don't know even existed, and that's a band called Working Week. They're a British band, and the album I am featuring here is called Working Nights. Now this band featured the singer Julie Roberts, and what this band was is a fusion band of both jazz, soul, and pop music. So for those of you who don't really love jazz or want to look into jazz a little bit, this is a very accessible album, and we'll have a few recognizable songs on it. But overall, I give this a big thumbs up. This was a great album from the 1980s and a band I was very happy to find. Next up is the first album entitled Indigo Girls by the Indigo Girls. This made up two women who had great vocal harmonies and had a folk sound. This was the duo of Amy Ray and Emily Sailors, and they went on to make some great follow-up albums, and some of them were successful radio hits. The other thing about the Indigo Girls is that they were a very influential female band, and many other female bands after them will say that the Indigo Girls did not only influence them, but inspired them in their decision into going into music. Here's another favorite band of mine in the pop world, and that's the DBs. And this is their second album entitled Repercussion. Here's another band like REM, although more pop sounding, that should have been a big hit band, but never made it. They basically went into almost obscurity. However, they made great pop songs with great guitar hooks. They had a great songwriting team in Holzapfel and Stamey, and both of them went on to make some really good sounding albums in their solo careers and other projects. Another great album from the 1980s was by a band entitled David and David, and it was their album called Boomtown. Now, this is an album that I always look forward to listening to. I really like this album. It had a great sound. It had a sound that I never tired of, and I still like this album today, you know, going almost 40 years later. So here's an album, Boomtown by David and David, that I highly recommend. I should never forget to mention the great band Squeeze, that in 1980 released their album entitled Argy Bargy. Now, although this was the first album in the States, they did have an EP that was released in Great Britain, later available in the US, with some of their early hits, and they were quite intelligent songs. Squeeze had the songwriting team of Tilbrook and Difford, and many critics compared them to Lennon and McCartney. Now, yes, they were a great songwriting team. I'm not sure I would have compared them to Lennon and McCartney, but I do agree they wrote some great, fresh, pop-sounding songs. And last but not least, the album that I think was probably the best album of the 1980s. It came out in 1987, and it was by the Irish band U2, and of course, it is their classic album, The Joshua Tree. This is their fifth studio album. It had a wonderful sound. It was an album that was extremely successful, had many popular hits on the album, and this album was based on the American scene, both politically and historically. This album was extremely successful and sold 25 million copies worldwide, and this made the band from being very popular to superstars. Well, there you have it, my list of the albums that saved the 1980s for me, and all of these albums are well worth owning. If you're not familiar with these albums, this would be a great time to check them out and see some of the great music you may have missed. And who knows, these albums may become some of your favorites in your collection. And now for last video's unknown album. The first unknown album, and I would say both unknown albums, I made it a little more difficult. I was showing only the back cover because I thought the front cover would make it too easy. And the first one is the second album by Elvis Costello, entitled This Year's Model. This second studio album was released in March of 1978, and it met with both critical acclaim and pretty good success on the charts as well. This was the first album to feature the band The Attractions. This was made up of Bruce Thomas, Pete Thomas, and Steve Nieve. This album reached number 4 on the UK charts and reached number 30 on the Billboard LP charts. In 2021, many of you might want to know, this album was re-released and was remastered. The second unknown album is also the back cover of the debut release of The Specials. This album came out in October of 1979. The Specials was one of the defining bands of the British New Wave, and this was one of the most important bands, if not the most important band, of the ska revival. This was a politically and socially conscious album, and this album also represented the anger of the youth in the UK. This album reached number 4 on the UK charts and number 84 on the Billboard 100 charts in the US. Also interestingly to note that there is a slight relation to the first album I showed, in that this album was actually produced by Elvis Costello. And now for this video's unknown albums. The first unknown album. Okay, hope you got that one. The second unknown album. Okay, hope you got that one too. As always, if you think you know the answers, let me know in the comment sections below and I'll tell you how you did. As always, this is Alex with All About Albums. Thanks for listening. Have a great day. And remember, keep them spinning.